Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Sarah Rosen-Mortel with the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute and of thanking you all for joining us. First, we probably all know how to do this now, but a few housekeeping notes. We are recording this event and we will post the relevant links and the recording online after the event on the event homepage at urban.org. Live captions are turned on, so if you want to turn those off, click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. All participants are automatically muted. Type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. And we'll be sharing a link to a post-event survey, and we ask that you share your feedback with us. It's helpful for us and the panelists to hear what you're thinking about and shape what we do in the future. And finally, let me encourage you to join the conversation on social media. On Twitter, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, and at the bios and related links, I am hoping we will have people's Twitter handles as well. With the logistics behind us, let me just do 1 minute of framing if I could. Today's topic is wealth inequality, specifically how we might build a systems approach to closing the racial wealth gap and how baby bonds might fit as one part of a broader strategy. Wealth inequality has been acute in America for centuries and seems to be getting worse again of late. According to Urban Research, in 2019, white households had 8 times the wealth of Black households and 5 times the wealth of Latinx households. And despite some fluctuations over the past 4 decades, this disparity was as high in 2019 as it was in 1983 for the typical Black family. And between the pandemic and rising inflation, house prices, and record student debt, we have reasons to fear that the gulf could be widening further ahead. There's good news too. The long overdue racial reckoning triggered by George Floyd's murder and the pandemic as well prompted a much more direct focus on wealth. And let me just say that when we say wealth, we don't mean only the assets of the very wealthy themselves. Wealth is a few dollars to deal with unexpected expenses. It's the ability to own a car, to get to a better job, to help pay for enrichment expenses for your child in school or for education and training for yourself, or to invest in a small business. Intergenerational wealth transfer is the most powerful way in which inequalities of one generation are hardened and perpetuated. And many of our society's policy strategies to encourage wealth accumulation, like tax subsidies for retirement, actually can sometimes subsidize those who already have some access to wealth to gain more, while leaving those with no access to wealth out entirely. In some ways, this is a textbook definition of structural racism. Of course, income inequality is critical as well, but without access to wealth building strategies, this chance to get ahead and close the stark gap between people of different races in America, more equitable access to economic mobility, will never come. Recently, however, we've seen several policies proposed to try to help more families, especially those long facing barriers to wealth, instead grow wealth and address racial wealth inequalities. Baby bonds is one such policy that's gaining traction across the United States. In 2001, both Connecticut and the District of Columbia passed baby bonds legislation. These laws created state-funded trusts for children and families with low incomes. Just this month, California approved $100 million in its 2022-23 budget for trusts for children who lost a caregiver to COVID or who have been in foster care long-term. And now Washington State and Massachusetts both have task forces charged with exploring the feasibility of baby bonds for their states. And as of today, we're tracking legislation in 5 additional states as well. As more governments across the United States start designing and implementing baby bonds legislation, it's paramount to learn how baby bonds are alike and distinct from other wealth and income policies, and how they might fit in practice alongside other wealth building and income supporting programs in budgets, priorities, and the populations they served. And that's our goal today. So as you listen to the 2 panels that we're going to hear from shortly, I encourage you to reference a draft handout that I think has just been linked or will shortly be linked in the chat. It will help describe baby bonds for those who are less familiar and present some of the distinctions from other policies that we're going to be talking about today. This is a draft. We'll eventually publish it, and we welcome comments and feedback on it as my colleagues continue the work. But before we start the program, let me just add a couple quick thanks. First, we have an extraordinary group of speakers here, and they'll be introduced by their moderators, but just my thanks to all of you. Also, my thanks to my colleagues here at Urban, Madeline Brown, Catherine Harvey, Signa Mary McKernan, Emma Fernandez, Ofrana Mabua, and Trina Shanks. All have worked hard to put this event on together, and their work to establish what we know about how to advance wealth building and close equity gaps is growing. It's a very exciting part of our own program here. I also want to say a word of thanks to my former colleague, Kololo Kizikazi. She's now the acting commissioner of the Social Security Administration, having been named by President Biden to be the deputy for policy there. But while she was at Urban, and before that, during her time at the Ford Foundation, Kololo played a critical role focusing on economic security for working families and how we could tear down systemic barriers facing people of color. In fact, early in the pandemic, Kololo, Senator Booker, and Derek Hamilton and I did an event around baby bonds and wealth inequality that you can also find the video available on Urban's website. So one final thanks, and that's to our friends and colleagues at the JPMorgan Chase Foundation, who have provided support that's allowed us to grow this community of learning around baby bonds, including hosting this event today. Over the years, Urban's collaboration with JPMorgan Chase has allowed us to leverage data and analytics to accelerate solutions on a range of questions and to equip policymakers and practitioners to make fact-based decisions on the front lines. So I'm really excited to introduce Heather Hagenbotham, who's joining us today to also share a few framing thoughts. She's currently the managing director and co-head of global philanthropy, as well as the head of research and policy for JPMorgan Chase & Company. In this role, she leads efforts to create an inclusive, growing economy and advance racial equity. She oversees the JPMorgan Chase Institute and Policy Center, which together champion evidence-based policy that advances an inclusive economy through distinctive research and cross-center engagement. She has a wide range of expertise in the public sector and the private sector and nonprofits. She was both at CARE USA and the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources and Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget. And we're very pleased that she has recently become a member of the Board of Trustees of the Urban Institute. So it's really nice for us to have you here, Heather, and to kick us off. My thanks to everyone. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's truly an honor to be a member of the Board of Trustees of the Urban Institute. And thank all of you for being here today for this important conversation. As Sarah mentioned, I play a role at JPMorgan Chase overseeing philanthropy, research, and policy, and it's really focused on how we can build a more inclusive economy and help to close the racial wealth gap. There's a lot of data, and Sarah just mentioned some detailing the racial wealth gap. And that's likely known to many of you. I wanted to highlight just one piece of research that was undertaken by the JPMorgan Chase Institute. Our research showed that the median Black and Latino household earned 70 cents in take-home income for every dollar earned by white families, and that the gaps in liquid assets are double those seen for take-home income. As we're working across our firm to address these gaps, from our $30 billion racial equity business commitment, philanthropy, original research, and policy, we're continually seeking to find promising solutions that can be tested and scaled. And we believe that baby bonds are one such promising tool to address wealth inequality, especially for Black and Latino families. I wanted to share with this group that in 2020, our CEO, Jamie Dimon, and other Business Roundtable CEOs announced an agenda to address barriers to equity and justice that included a specific focus on helping Americans of color develop financial security. That group, recognizing the potential impact of baby bonds, urged policymakers to enact legislation to pilot a program to test the effectiveness of baby bonds. We think it's very important that the private sector be engaged in learning about effective tools to address the racial wealth gap. Over the past 2 years, as Sarah was alluding to, many corporations have made commitments to address racial equity through their own policies and products, as well as through philanthropy and engagement. But policy also has to be part of the solution. These long-standing systemic challenges require that all hands-on-deck approach. Government can't do it alone, nor can the nonprofit or private sectors. So we're really encouraged to see the momentum that baby bonds is gaining at the state level, are so eager to learn alongside other partners about the efficacy of these approaches. And we really hope that conversations like this one can bring together as many potential partners as possible, including the private sector, to support these systemic scalable solutions to address the racial wealth gap. And to get us started, I'm going to hand it over to Jim Taylor, the Chief Equity Officer for Urban.
Thanks so much, Heather. I have the privilege of moderating our first panel today, which is all about putting baby bonds in context in terms of what they are and how they fit with other policies. I'm thrilled to introduce our three panelists who will now join us on camera and share their expertise with us. I'll start by introducing Diedrich Asante Muhammad. Diedrich is Chief of Membership, Policy and Equity at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Grieve Chelwa is Director of Research at the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. And Trina R. Shanks. Trina is Director at School of Social Work, Community Engagement, Harold R. Johnson Collegiate Professor of Social Work, and Faculty Associate at Survey Research Center, the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Diedrich, Grieve, and Trina, it's great to see you all and to have you with us today. Diedrich, I'd like to start our conversation today with you. We are all familiar with the fact that we have racial wealth inequities in the US, as both Sarah and Heather just touched on in their introductory remarks today. Can you provide an overview of the current state of racial wealth inequities and how wealth building policies could help to address and reduce the gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most concerning aspect of racial wealth inequality today has been how little change we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years. I think, whether we see, we've seen some growth in disparity, I guess, during recessionary times, but even during times of economic strengthening, we see little bridging of racial wealth inequality, with, strongest amounts between African Americans and white Americans, Latinos still having a very substantial racial wealth inequality. And there's little data on Asian Americans, but even with Asian Americans, we've seen, even though Asian American median income can be higher in a household, the 2013 data, which is the most recent data I've seen, still had a significant disparity between Asian American households and white American households. So part of the issue is getting stronger data. There's very little on Native Americans, but you can see with the income and home ownership levels that you would assume there's strong, great racial wealth inequality. And what I think that speaks to is that market forces alone and that the tearing down of outright racial inequality, outright segregation practices will not solve it. I think there's a discussion as it relates to racial inequality or race relations that we haven't gotten there, but we're on the right path. And I think the takeaway from the racial wealth divide is we're not even on the right path. We're on the path on maintaining deep economic ongoing apartheid unless we have some significant changes in investments.
Great. Thank you, Diedrich, for that overview. Let's go over to you, Grieve. As we turn our attention to the basics of baby bond policy, what are some of the essential required elements for a baby bond policy to have significant impact and in terms of addressing some of the racial wealth inequities that Diedrich just shared?
Thanks, Jim, for that question. And I want to say thanks to Urban and thanks to JP Morgan Chase for bringing all of us together today to discuss this very important topic. And I think Diedrich has so eloquently showed that we have an incredible wealth gap in the US. And Diedrich has made the case that this gap is not reducing. He's made the case that this gap has this tendency to grow over time. And I think what we're discussing today is very important policy innovation that could go a long way in reducing that gap. So, what are some of the essential elements of baby bonds? And some of these elements I'll discuss shortly were contained quite recently. I think it's worth making the shout out in a recent publication that my institute that I work for, the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, and Prosperity Now took out earlier this year. It's called A Brighter Future with Baby Bonds, how states and cities should invest in baby bonds. And these are some of the essential elements that were articulated in that publication. The first one is that children receive a substantial initial endowment, right? The endowment should be substantial enough to enable the recipient to invest in asset building activities that will offer a return of wealth over their lifetime, right? As we point out in our paper, what counts as substantial, and a substantial endowment is certainly relative, depending on the local aspect of asset markets, but it's important that policymakers take this into account, right? But what's important is that initial substantial endowment. A second element is that ideally we want larger investments made upfront, and these are preferred to allow for sufficient time for the investments to appreciate in value, right? In some of the initial formulations of the idea of baby bonds, as articulated by my colleague Derek Hamilton, is that lump sums would be set aside at birth. Initial formulation had this large lump sum at birth that would passively grow over time. But in some newer formulations, as states and localities are experimenting, as states and localities face funding constraints, we see this in a situation where there's some initial endowment at birth to which additional investments are made to maturity over time. But the important point is that the first or the earlier investments are large. What's also important is progressive seeding of investments. If the objective, which it is to reduce wealth disparities, particularly the racial wealth gap, we want to make sure that babies or children coming from lower resourced households tend to have much bigger endowments, right? And ideally, we want the criterion to be wealth, right? So the criterion should be household wealth. But we know that it's very difficult currently to measure wealth. So we see some states and localities experimenting with different criterions that approximate wealth. For example, Medicaid eligibility, as we've seen in Connecticut, or household income, as we see in DC. Another important, and I'll be quick with this, another important element is automatic enrollment, right? We want qualifying children who are from lower resource households to be automatically enrolled, right? Which is essentially the program should have an opt-out element as opposed to an opt-in element. And the reason for this is simple. We tend to see in history that households, children or better resourced households tend to better enroll for public assistance programs, whereas lower resourced households tend to suffer for all sorts of reasons. So we want automatic enrollment to be the one of the defining characteristics. And then something which is also more important and has been hotly debated is we would like restrictions of funds to wealth generating activities. At maturity, we want the proceeds of the funds to be invested in activities that will generate wealth, buying a home, paying for college, or invest a small startup for a business. And the reason for this is that we have lots of evidence, seminally articulated by Hamilton and Chiteji in 2002, showing that children from lower resource households often tend to have large familial pressures for assistance. So if this money arrives at maturity and we don't restrict it in this way, there is a risk that money will be used, to help out relatives, which is understandable, and so it's an understandable and emotional pressure. But we're hoping to close the racial wealth gap. And lastly, this emphasis on endowments that are publicly seeded, right? Some other initiatives allow for public and private seeding, but with baby bonds, we're particularly interested in public seeding of the endowment. Only a government should seed and make additional contributions to these trust accounts, because again, the objective is to reduce wealth divides. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we might end up exacerbating the divides. So Jim, these are some of the initial elements, or some of the essential elements of baby bonds, but I'm sure some of the conversations around this will happen in the course of today's panel.
Thank you so much, Grieve, for that really outstanding overview of the essential elements here. Trina, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now and ask you to share how baby bonds are distinct from or complementary to other initiatives like 529s or children's savings accounts and other income supports. Where do baby bonds fit into the suite of programs that allow people to meet their individual goals?
Thank you, Jim, for that question. And I also would like to thank the Urban Institute for putting this together, and hopefully we can have a great conversation that will continue even beyond today. I'd like to start by reiterating Diedrich's point that wealth inequalities have existed since this country's founding with chattel slavery, and has evolved with racism and policy and practice that continues and are structural. And so regular market forces aren't going to resolve them. And actually, after reaching all-time lows in the 1970s, wealth inequality overall has been increasing steadily since the 1980s. And so I'd like to start by saying that in 1991, Michael Sheraton actually proposed inclusive, progressive, lifelong asset building policy as a way to reduce wealth inequality in his book, Assets in the Poor. But ironically, the initial attempt at implementing these ideas were individual development accounts, which were match savings accounts for adults earning less than twice the poverty line, and typically were very time limited to just a few years. And so these IDA accounts were important, however, because they shifted the policy conversation from having a bifurcated approach to social welfare, where low-income families were offered consumption and income support, while higher-income families were offered tax breaks for asset building purposes, which only exacerbated already growing wealth inequality. But now, if you start to think about this idea of building assets early in life, starting with children, focusing on young people, there are other policy approaches that currently exist. So if you want to look at kind of tax policy, one of the first things that was put into place was the 529 college savings plan, which is part of the tax code, became popular and kind of nationwide in the 1990s. And so they require personal savings though. They offer tax breaks on growth, but it's really limited to educational expenses. And so even though 529 accounts are available nationwide in every state, in their current form, they're very regressive. Less than 18% of 18-year-olds participate. And even though many states are working to increase access, and states that have created child development accounts sometimes use a 529 platform, which I'll talk about in just a second, they often has been seen as a tax break for the wealthy. And rather than a way of reducing wealth inequity, they actually seem to sustain it. Experts have generated proposals to redesign 529s to make them more inclusive. And I can make sure we share links to some of those articles. But just to know, that kind of is one of the first things that existed. But mostly for higher end people to kind of pass their wealth along to their children and grandchildren and people they know, but not so much to reduce wealth inequalities and racial wealth inequalities and those at the low end of the income and wealth distributions. So other things that have been tried are promise scholarships and this idea of having debt-free college. Given that the rising cost of college, people said we need to make sure that people don't leave college, particularly low-income first-gen families don't leave college with debt. Many places offer promise scholarships. One of the more premier programs is the Kalamazoo Promise here in Michigan. And so students residing in particular geographic areas can have all of their college tuition paid for. The best programs like Kalamazoo have first dollar programs, so they get the money to pay for tuition up front. So then Pell Grants and financial aid and other things can provide money to these students to pay for books and living expenses. But the majority actually have last dollar scholarships. So they have to first tap into financial aid and Pell Grants and other things that are available. And then the last dollars are paid. And when those kind of programs exist, they actually don't provide money in hand for students to pay for other expenses like living expenses and books. And obviously for students who don't actually enroll in post-secondary education or don't complete their degrees, they don't really receive much from these opportunities. I might like to move on to child development accounts. And so there's a version of these accounts that exist and have been launched throughout the country. 7 states have actually passed legislation to enroll all newborns into a state account with the opening deposit. Pilot programs in SEED, which was saving for education, entrepreneurship, and down payment, were as high as $1,000. Current programs range from as little as $5 to $25.50 to as high as $500 in Maine. Working with local partners, they also weave together resources and activities to assist families and children prepare for these opportunities. Often states use the 529 platform, but because it's an automatic enrollment that's universal for all students, it provides some of the things that Grieve was talking about that we look for in these positive accounts. And actually, if that initial deposit was really high, it could be close to what some places are proposing as baby bonds. It's also important to realize that other countries have implemented innovations like this. So if you're willing to look outside of the US context, there are other promising models, particularly Singapore, that actually does have a lifelong model. So they have accounts at birth that can be used for developmentally appropriate things if there's health issues. Then they transfer to like a college savings account type thing until young people go to college. If there's money left over, it goes into a retirement account called the Central Provident account. It really is lifelong, and families do use these very innovative accounts to do all sorts of wealth building activities. United Kingdom, Israel, Canada, Korea have lots of these types of programs. If you want to see what other countries are doing, that's another model the US may want to look at. But given what we're talking about today, the promise of baby bonds, as they've been defined, is there'll be large amounts of money going to low wealth families without requiring personal savings in ways that have a high likelihood of reducing racial wealth inequality. And so I'd like to make a few caveats before I end. Baby bonds, as of now, have been proposed, but not fully implemented, although DC is close. And nowhere right now are they universal, like child savings accounts are. So proposals are enrolling children born in Medicaid eligible families or families affected by COVID, but not all young people. So you're sure to miss some wealth poor families. And as I mentioned before, small tweaks to existing programs, such as expanding CDA programs to include large universal deposits, annual contributions, would still get us pretty close to what some people are proposing as baby bonds. And I'll stop there and I'll turn it back to you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Trina, for that description of baby bonds in terms of the distinctions between baby bonds and other initiatives in this space, and where baby bonds fit into the context with other initiatives. And I'd like to come back over to you now, Grieve, and sort of staying on the topic of describing baby bonds. Would love to have you share with us some of the differences between these programs, these baby bond programs, in terms of goals and scale and target populations, structures, funding sources, all of those sort of characteristics.
Thanks for that question, Jim. And Trina did an excellent job in really giving us sort of a very detailed description of each of these programs and how they are different. So I won't really rehash what she eloquently said, but I think all these programs in theory have the goal of increasing economic security so that everyone has some level of baseline resources that foster authentic agency, self-determination, and dignity. I think that's what we're all striving. That's the intent, and that's the North Star. But in practice, and as Trina has shown, as in the case of many initiatives, we have some differences in the way they're rolled out, in the uptake, in the benefit, in who's benefiting, and so on and so forth. And I'll spend some time talking about that. I mean, the defining difference between baby bonds and these other initiatives is the scale of the program, at least as ideally formulated or as theoretically formulated. A large endowment at the beginning that is publicly seeded, that reduces wealth disparities, that especially reduces the racial wealth gap. And that's the defining difference between baby bonds and these other initiatives. With child savings accounts, the investments sometimes are modest and might even, in some settings, we've seen enhance inequalities because of the matched savings aspect or incentive. The fact that households are incentivized to save via public matching. And so better resourced households will save more, in theory, relative to lower resourced households. And then you have inequalities, in some instances, growing. With 529s, and I think Trina made this point, with 529s, and because of the tax-free treatment, there is evidence that they tend to be regressive. That is only better resourced households tend to benefit from them because the benefit really comes from the tax-free treatment. So those are some of the differences. Proceeds from child savings accounts, for example, can go towards college, buying a home, or starting a small business, much like baby bonds. And I think Trina made this point that in some places we're seeing, rollouts of baby bonds that look quite like CSAs. Whereas 529s are restricted to college. So that's one difference, fundamental difference. In terms of funding, with CSA, you've got public funding that's partial via this matched savings approach, and then the other aspect is private. With baby bonds, the idea as conceptualized is that the funding should be public, right? Public funding alone, not allow for any private funding, precisely because of the intent. The intent is increase economic security, but also reduce disparities in economic securities, disparities in wealth, disparities in sort of reduce the racial wealth gap. With 529, the subsidy is implied via tax-free treatment of gains, capital gains, and that withdrawal. right? Whereas, again, another important difference is whereas baby bonds, CSAs, and 529s point towards some form of asset building, right? And I think there's an issue of income support initiatives. We haven't talked a lot about income support initiatives, but income support initiatives do not necessarily have this as a direct goal. The goal of income support initiatives is not asset building. It's merely just to provide income support to meet daily subsistence requirements. And under the income support debate, we have an interesting debate between guaranteed income, privileging the poor, versus universal basic income, guaranteeing everyone something, which then has implications for inequality as well. So, Jim, I think these are some of the differences around, does it enhance inequality? Does it reduce inequality? And I think who funds it, how is it funded? But these are some of the interesting differences that I've been able to, ascertain from these different policy initiatives.
Thank you, Grieve. And before we go back to Diedrich, Grieve, I want to stay with you for a follow-up based on some things that are coming into the Q&A box related to eligibility. And so my follow-up to you is, in theory, who is eligible for a baby bond, and how is that assessed year over year? And if wealth is not used for eligibility, what are we seeing in terms of what's being used as a proxy?
Yeah, that's an important question. I mean, as the program was initially conceptualized, ideally we want to target wealth, right? We want wealth to be the qualifying criteria, because essentially wealth is the most paramount indicator of economic security, right? Not income, but wealth. And often the gaps in wealth, the racial wealth gap is much bigger than the racial income gap. So we want wealth. Ideally, that's what we want. But we have a scarcity of wealth data. The wealth data that we have in the US is not great. We haven't done a good job of collecting timeously and very, very detailed wealth data. So second best is to approximate things that approximate wealth. Income does in some ways correlated with wealth, not an excellent indicator of wealth, but it's correlated with it. So you find, like in the program in DC that Trina referenced, I think there the qualifying criteria is income, right? So I think it's, I've forgotten the specifics, but it's 300% of the federal poverty line, or something like that. So that's income. In Connecticut, the program that was implemented in Connecticut, the criteria there is Medicaid eligibility. I think it's called Husky in Connecticut. So families that are eligible for state Medicaid qualify, and they get some amount. So what you're essentially seeing is folks trying to experiment, given that you don't have great wealth data, with really great approximations of it, but they're not perfect, but they get us somewhere. I think the North Star is to get wealth. And I think we heard about California, and I think, if I've forgotten, California is using some COVID criterion. But we also know that, whether a household had an adverse experience with COVID, whether it became a death or et cetera, it's also correlated with wealth at some level. So, Jim, that's my answer. States are doing the best they can, given we don't have this North Star wealth. Yeah.
Thank you, Grieve. Diedrich, I want to come back to you. You started off this conversation today by sharing with us an overview of really some of the severity in terms of the racial wealth inequities that we see in the U.S. As a follow-up to you, I'd like to ask, what do you think is the benefit in terms of racial wealth and income inequities in pursuing programs focused on wealth alongside programs focused on income?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you are kind of giving the answer in the question, in that it's not wealth or income, and it's not baby bonds versus free higher education, right? It's what really creates private wealth as a whole is a whole series of assets, right? And part of those assets is income. Part of that is actually having access to capital, which we were trying to provide through these baby bond programs, safe neighborhoods, all of these things. And so, I think the important thing about the baby bond program is, and I guess I want to restate, I think one of the most important things about the baby bond program is one of the few programs that was designed specifically to address the racial wealth divide. I think many of the other programs were addressed to deal with, the plight of poor people or lower income, maybe overall inequality, but this was focused specifically on the racial wealth divide. I think child savings accounts had some ideas of what it could do to address racial inequality, but again, it didn't have the same analysis. And so, I think it was designed to be added on to the various programs that have gotten us to where we are today, which is we have had lower levels of absolute poverty for African Americans, Latinos in the country as a whole. We do have higher high school graduation rates, higher college graduation rates, though not as much bridging of college graduation as we would like to have seen. And so I think, again, the importance of baby bonds, and one thing we haven't talked about is that, we've seen that with wealth inequality overall, that a significant part of that is that the wealth that has grown through through finance and investment has been much stronger than obviously income increases, but even the growth or the increase in housing and how much housing is. And so the little black wealth, medium black wealth, not including depreciating assets for African American, is 9,000. And that includes home equity, right? But home equity doesn't go as fast as increase in investments. I think the baby bonds is an interesting thing in that it's putting aside money that will grow with the increase in finance and investments in stocks and these types of things. So I think it's a very important piece, though it shouldn't be considered the only piece necessary to bridge racial wealth inequality.
Great. Thank you so much, Diedrich. Trina, I want to come back over to you now and touch on a subject that Grieve mentioned in one of his earlier comments. And the topic here is that, one of the current debates we've seen in the field as baby bonds legislation has been introduced in states is over allowable uses for the funds. That is that some proposals define approved uses of funds while others allow the individual to use the funds in whatever ways they choose to do so. Based on what we know from similar models, what are some of the pros and cons of articulating allowable uses?
Thanks for that question, Jim. As has been stated, many current child development account programs, and particularly 529 programs, are limited to post-secondary education, which can be a potential drawback, especially for those who have funds remaining after education or don't pursue post-secondary education at all. They're completely left out of those instances. It would be helpful to expand to other asset building purposes, as Grieve has mentioned, such as home ownership, starting a business, even retirement savings. That's what exists in Singapore after someone has either completed or reached the age of completing post-secondary education. But places like the United Kingdom put no restrictions on usage at all in their child trust funds once young people reach the age of 18. And so on some level, this seems liberating. People can choose to use their funds for whatever might be best for them at the time. People have different needs and desires, and they'd be able to pursue their own interests, kind of the pursuit of happiness idea. The problem, though, is if money is spent on one-off expenses or consumption, once that money is spent, it's gone. And then there's nothing left of value to fall back on or to invest. So obviously investing in education, it's likely that one can demand a higher income in the future. Investing in a home means that equity can build, which can be borrowed against or sold for gain. Investing in a business means that one can earn revenue over time and sell any physical property as needed. And obviously investing in retirement savings means you have more money to live on in old age. So these are things that have a life beyond just the one-time use if you did it for consumption, that isn't asset building. And if at least one goal of baby bonds is to give young people from families with limited wealth a springboard to better opportunities and a future with greater economic security, then putting parameters around allowable uses would be helpful. They wouldn't have to be worried about being approached to deal with family members' financial burdens, as Grieve has mentioned. They would be given a limited set of proven strategies to build wealth, and they could also participate in asset-specific training as needed. And we know from the IDA work that was done in the past that if someone who is from a family that's never bought a home and they have someone to kind of make sure they get a good interest rate, make sure they have the best information possible, that's a lot more helpful than being completely on their own. So being able to have asset-specific training, if you have very specific qualified uses, is also a benefit. So I'll stop there because this is obviously up for debate, but those are the reasons why I think it's better to have some narrowed uses, even though there are places that people can use it for anything they want.
Thank you, Trina. We have a follow-up from the audience here, and the question from the audience is 18 years old too late to help build wealth? How well have other wealth building programs delivered on the promise of building wealth?
if that's to me, I would say if you're contrasting, let's say, an IDA, Individual Development Account Program, with the CDA, Child Development Account Program or Baby Bond Program, the real difference is you start from birth or early on, so you have 15 to 18 years for this thing to grow. If you're the IDA, you're looking at a person in real time who's already earning less than the poverty line, already struggling with wealth, already kind of behind. And then as an adult, you're trying to help them build wealth with something like IDA. The nice thing about all of these child-focused ones is that you have a larger time horizon for the investment to grow. And ideally, particularly if it's something that's statewide or citywide or nationwide, you have a chance to build some educational opportunities, some supports, some weaving with other programs that exist at the local level. So it's not just waiting till they're 18 to use it, but you have all that time until the child grows to be 18 for both the wealth to grow and the initial deposit to grow over time, but also to provide some opportunities to support the young people and their families so they can make the best choices possible.
And if I could jump in real quick on that, I was reading the question, and I think, it was almost posed as if, well, should we invest later or should we invest when they're young children? And the idea is that, of course, you want to be investing when children are young. But the idea of the baby bond is, you're giving yourself almost 20 years to an allowed initial investment to become a larger investment. And I think this also points to, if we really want to address the racial wealth divide, these types of programs really need to be multi-generational, right? So the positive impact that someone who gets a baby bond now and it has on their life affects their kid's life. And then their kid is also getting the baby bond, right? Because again, wealth, I think that's an important analysis of looking at wealth inequality, is that you're not going to solve it by, one immediate investment, a 5 or 10 year, but it's long-term understanding of asset building. So yeah, we need strong children development programs and safety and good education. But one of the things that even we see with, Black kids and white kids of higher income, that lack of wealth still limits their ability to move forward. So, this is what the baby bond is really adding, something that really doesn't exist right now, is capital in adulthood that and tries to universalize it, at least in its theory.
Thank you, Deidre. Grief, I want to come back over to you with a question around having a sustained funding source for baby bond programs. Would you speak to how baby bond programs can access a sustained source of funding to ensure long-term programming that will be immune to any changes that may occur at political levels?
Thanks, Jim. And that's a very important question, because we want this policy to be sustainable, to be around for a very, very long time, perhaps forever, because of some of the benefits that we've articulated in this panel. This is an interesting question. In our joint work with Prosperity Now that I referenced earlier, we advise, for example, against funding baby bonds via the general and annual appropriations process, which is itself, subject to political dynamics, like you've just illustrated, Jim, there. Rather, we advise that baby bonds be funded and tied to more relatively stable sources, particularly taxes. I mean, so it's not guaranteed that taxes can be taken away, but it's relatively much more stable. For example, raising estate taxes in states or in localities that have them, or introducing them, wealth taxes, introducing wealth taxes, the millionaire's tax, a tax on wealth. You could say if folks have wealth beyond a certain level, which also requires that we're collecting wealth data, you levy some form of a wealth tax. A millionaire's tax, you might say, folks were, so fortunate to be earning more than $1 million a year, they incur some taxes, which can be then directed towards funding baby bonds. Perhaps as we, finally, legalizing, marijuana use across the US, we could tax that as well. So these are some of the ways in which we could ensure the financial sustainability of baby bonds. Think about taxes, but again, we also have to be very careful that as we introduce new taxes, we're introducing those taxes in a way that's progressive and not regressive, right? In a way that's not harming lower resourced folks. But those are some of the ways in which, Jim, we could make baby bonds much more sustainable and much more, relatively more insulated from the, year-to-year political process.
Thank you, Grieve. This next question, I would just like to pose really to all of you. If people listening to this conversation decide that they want to engage in advancing baby bond policies and programs, how would you suggest they engage?
I can jump in on that one. One of the things that at least I try to do here in Michigan and in Detroit and Washtenaw County, the places where I am, is really be aware of the mix of policies that are available to children in the local area. And if everything right now focuses on consumption and income, push for greater asset building policies and approaches, and point to baby bonds and child development account legislations in other states and cities to model after. And if your state does have a child savings account program, or your local area has promised scholarships, to think about how to increase those initial deposits and connect to local partners and offer more resources in a way that intentionally engages low to moderate income families and low wealth families and helps them take advantage of the programming that already exists. One of the things that, well, I'll stop there, but I'll just say that be aware of what exists locally and actually build upon that. And if nothing exists for children to build wealth, then look at these examples that exist both in the US and in other countries.
I'll just jump in and say, if you're part of a local organization, I would, recommend joining into coalitions of local organizations that are doing wealth building advocacy or advocacy around community economic development. Prosperity Now has been mentioned, and they have many different members who focus on this type of wealth building advocacy. I'm part of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. We have over 600 membership groups that focus on community economic development, and being part of these organizations and helping to learn some promising practices and strengthen your advocacy around what wealth building can look like in your community, and making sure if the conversation has to start around baby bonds in your community to put that in as something that should be discussed.
Jim, I think I can't say more to what Dedrick and Trina have said. Just find out what's happening in your state and your locality, see what's happening in other states, and try to make the noise for baby bonds in your area. I think. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all for your responses to that question. I'm going to, for the last question for you all that I would like to share before we move into the next panel. A couple of questions from the audience. Do you have any general reactions to the idea that instead of wealth and income inequality, we should focus on consumption inequality? And are there any protections being proposed to prevent beneficiaries from being scammed?
Those are good questions. I'd say the one thing I would say, if you're looking at wealth and income versus consumption, the US has done okay on things like food stamps and SNAP benefits. We're not so good at housing, but at least there is some programming around housing. The one thing that really doesn't exist is wealth inequality, right? That's the kind of the elephant in the room that really doesn't exist hardly at all, which is why I think it's so important to address. The idea of scams, that's why I think having these supports around either asset-specific purchases or safe products, so that people will have something that is made for them that speaks to the needs of low to moderate income families and make sure that they aren't as likely to get scammed. But I'll pass it over to Dedrick and Green to see if they have more to say.
Well, I'll just, I think it is important, the history of this baby bonds program, because I think as was mentioned that, I think America made some progress in this terms of income supplements, right? And even trying to deal with consumption supplements, right? This idea for, subsidizing food and subsidizing these types of things. But, this baby bond and the whole asset building piece came out of, and this is the next step, is that we've done something. And again, we need more on income supplements. We need more on other type of consumption supplements, but we really need to further start this, wealth building component. And then what was the second question?
The second question was, are there protections being proposed to prevent beneficiaries from being scammed?
Yeah. And again, I think, that would be more in the development of policies. I'll just say particularly, I would advocate for actually a later starting age than 18. I mean, I think 18 is kind of young. And I think a lot of the wealth building investments that you're going to want, you know, the capital you're going to need should be something that happens more like around 25 or something like that. Because, you know, like we don't want it to go into, you know, a college or a bad college program and it just gets, you know, evaporated into that. We want it to kind of build off of, you know, these assets. And so I think one thing could be done is bring it a little bit later into life to make sure it can't be spent before it's put forward. But I've also heard a lot of conversations about, you know, tying this to, just like a lot of housing programs are tied to some type of financial education aspect, which I think, you know, is important as well.
Grieve, I'll give you the last word before we move on to our next panel.
Yeah, and very quickly, I think Trina and Dedrick have done justice to both questions. On this question about wealth or consumption, you know, it's an interesting one. I don't know how you would reduce, I hadn't thought about it, but how you would reduce consumption inequality without thinking about wealth. I mean, certainly what is accumulated via wealth theoretically is consumed. Sometimes it's passed on from generation to generation. Yeah, but it's an interesting question. And I think wealth does much, much more than just this idea of consumption. You know, there's this idea of security, this idea of, you know, sleeping peacefully at night because you've got something put away in case the world goes upside down. That's a very interesting question, but I can't think of how one would reduce consumption inequality without thinking about, you know, in a real, meaningful, authentic way, without thinking about building assets via wealth.
Well, Dedrick, Grieve, and Trina, on behalf of all of the attendees today, I just want to say thank you for sharing your knowledge and perspectives with us today. And thank you for providing really a terrific segue into our next panel, which is focused on how to build a systems approach to closing the racial wealth gap. I'd like to now introduce my colleague, Rekha Balu, who will moderate the next panel. Rekha is co-vice president of the Urban Institute's Office of Race and Equity Research, and she is director of federal equity initiatives at Urban as well. Rekha, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And what an amazing conversation and such an engaged audience. I'm so excited to be here to be engaging with all of you on like what this next phase of developing a system around baby bonds. It isn't just it, but includes all the other policy instruments that were discussed today, what that includes. And in particular, how do we build on the evidence that has come from some of those earlier instruments, as well as think about what kind of evidence we might need to build going forward to help answer some of these questions that are coming up in the audience Q&A and I think in the policy world at large. So I am excited to introduce our panelists today. First, one of my colleagues here at the Urban Institute, Afrana Mabiu. She's a senior research associate in our Income and Benefits Policy Center and our Office of Race and Equity Research. Ray Boshara, a senior advisor at the Institute for Economic Equity at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And local to DC, Alicia DeFazio, community director of the Business and Economic Development for the Council of District of Columbia. So thank you all for joining us today. As you've heard, you know, lots of interest in different models and different ways of setting up this approach. And so maybe picking up on some of these questions, Ray, that you've been seeing in the chat and elsewhere, can you just give us a quick summary of what we've learned from evaluations that have been done thus far on individual development accounts, child savings accounts, and other predecessors or relatives to baby trust, let's say? I mean, in particular, thinking about what has and hasn't worked, not just about the implementation of those instruments, but their ability to achieve their intended outcomes.
Thank you, Rekha. Thank you, Urban, JP Morgan Chase. It's great to be a part of this discussion. Yeah, so sum up 25 years here in a couple minutes. I'll do my best.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, you know, I think I boiled it down to three sort of key lessons, experimenting with individual development accounts and child savings accounts over the last 25 years. The first is that low-income families can save and build wealth. And believe me, that wasn't a given when we started. That was the principal doubt. So through publicly and privately funded demonstrations, you know, we've learned that low-income families can save and build wealth. You know, there was an evaluation that the Urban Institute led, showing, you know, pretty significant increases in business and home ownership, you know, associated with IDAs, different seed experiments have shown a real asset growth and that families could save meaningful amounts of money, although modest. And the GAO found that families could save, 4 times as much than families that were not enrolled in some kind of a program. So that's the first lesson. Second is, I think a huge lesson was who had access to a structured savings mechanism really was what mattered more in determining who could save and build wealth. It wasn't really income that was the strongest predictor, but who had access. And so you think about things like, 529s, 401ks, Roth. This is how most people build wealth. But low-income people didn't have access to the mechanisms that made that wealth possible. So we've kind of learned that extending those structures to low-income families makes it possible for them to build savings and wealth as well. It's all about the structures, the plans, and the products, using what's on the books. And then finally, the third finding is that small amounts of savings can actually have a relatively large impact. And just very briefly, in the CEDOK experiment, they found that there are more positive parenting practices, better maternal health, higher educational expectations. And many of you have heard research showing that kids with like a college savings account in their name are 3 times more likely to enroll and 2.5 times more likely to graduate. So I think 25 years says this is a viable strategy. We can do it. It's just a matter of extending the subsidies, the structures, and the plans to other folks who've been left out.
And so, Alicia, recognizing that DC has really been leading the way in its commitment to baby trusts and other efforts to build wealth, I'm curious just to this question that's come up from the audience and the panelists, like, what does a whole of government approach to building this kind of equitable economic security look like? And to what extent did you all consider this evidence that Ray just mentioned and try to build on that and incorporate that?
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be present and, of course, to join the dialogue on this awesome topic and discussion. I wanted to, if I can, as a part of the answer to your question, just contextualize a bit why Washington, D.C. sought to go the route of investing in or establishing a baby trust fund program for residents. So currently here, the median wealth of a white family is 81 times higher than the median wealth of a Black family. So the inability for Black families in the district to access wealth building opportunities over time has driven many of the disparities we see across every indicator for success, be it employment, income, health, education, and the like. With respect to your question specifically in terms of what does it take or what does it look like for the whole of government to be supportive? Well, it began with the legislature. So initially, we got hold, if you will, of Senator Booker's proposal as it pertains to baby bonds, looked at some of the other academic work that had been done on the subject matter, and really weighed many of the various program design elements against realities that we saw here in the district. So it was the legislature, specifically Councilmember McDuffie, for whom that I work, that wanted to really look at directly chipping away at the stark racial wealth gap that's present here in the District of Columbia, and wanted to focus in on lower household incomes or lower income households first. So we went around, about it by designing a program, by working with, many folk in academia, many folks that were local to the district, whether it be, some of our legal aid serving organizations, whether it be our birth to pre-K or 3 coalitions, and other residents who weighed in about the approach that we had. We also, as a committee, have oversight over our chief financial officer. So I saw some of the questions in the chat really talked about, should this be led by the legislature and or, the treasurer? So here in the district, we have an independent CFO, and it just so happens that our committee. So when we drafted the legislation, we knew that we had the CFO's office in mind with respect to implementation, being that, of course, they manage our, 457 programs and the like for district government residents or employees, and would have the most benefit, experience, and the like to be able to do this. So what I will say, and not to jump ahead to other questions, there were also a confluence of different factors that kind of led to wanting to do this with respect to funding being made available on the federal level, with respect to the unfortunate incident with Mr. George Floyd, with respect to the district just realizing that there is this stark racial wealth gap and wanting to do as much as it could. So I believe it was easier for the CFO's office, other members of the legislature, and the executive to really go into this together. And so while there was conversation, it was really supporting conversation. There's certain things that we could do to make this initial legislative proposal better, such that I believe what we enacted is something great. And of course can be built upon, whether it be by other jurisdictions or ourselves as we continue to move forward with evaluation and the like.
That's really interesting to think about bringing the executive and legislature together, and maybe an approach, an implementation strategy, and a legislative strategy also like coming together in the design phase as well as the implementation. And that role of the executive also makes me then think about what this experience might be like for families. And I'm curious about the measures that you all thought to put in place to kind of reduce the burden on families that might be there to take advantage of these trusts, given what we've heard about the maybe not as high as expected uptake of previous instruments like IDs and CSAs.
So Julie on the previous panel mentioned much of this, as well as the other participants there, with respect to program design, again, aiming at not necessarily, as you mentioned, burdening residents or their families that would be eligible. So one of the things that we knew we wanted to do was to start at a child's birth, right? Because of the benefit of compound interest and time. We wanted youth to have access to a meaningful amount of money later to invest in actual traditional proven wealth building opportunities as a way, of course, to ensure that this young person is able to escape whatever cycle of poverty and or pass down wealth to later generations. So a couple of things that Grieve mentioned was substantial endowment. So we kind of started backward, knowing that we wanted upwards of $25,000 to be made available. And so kind of doing the math and anticipating what compound interest would be and whatever investment vehicle would be used to grow this, saying that how about we have an initial deposit at $500 and up to $1,000 every year thereafter, depending on, again, the income range of the household. We also knew we wanted enrollment to be automatic and for there not to be a benefits cliff issue. So we made sure to exclude this income, if you will, or benefits from a household's gross income. So they would not lose the ability to qualify for social service programs and or student aid. So we also looked forward when it came to student aid, when it came to the young person potentially using this fund at the age of maturity or beyond for college and or trade school. So we exempt this from local taxation. We also wanted to be very intentional about allowing the funds to be used on actual wealth building activities. So we have 5 buckets here of eligible activities. The first is home ownership. We also have business ownership, business investments, education, and retirement. And so I think this also goes to the question that the other panelists spoke to about asset-specific training, safe products, and hopefully the inability of young people from being swayed and or swindled in terms of how the funds could be used, because there are 5 against distinct categories by which the funds can actually be used.
Thanks, that's super helpful specific. So Afranima, thinking about then like what are the data that are available to help us like understand who might be able to take advantage of this, but then also like how well this instrument is serving to actually improve their outcomes. It gets us to the question of data on wealth. And I'll just start with the basic one, which is how complete or detailed even is wealth data in most states, particularly for families of color, who we have heard have not historically been participating in these wealth building initiatives. And how could those data, or to what extent could those data actually be used to be determining some of these eligible uses or even individual or household eligibility?
Thanks for that. So jurisdictions considering baby bonds obviously will want to know about what racial wealth inequity looks like in their areas and perhaps what potential impacts could be seen. So there are a lot of data sets out there, or not a lot. There are some good public data sets like Survey Consumer Finance, which is considered to be the ideal source, panel study income dynamics, among others to look at wealth data. But as Reed mentioned in the earlier panel, depending on the source, it'd be really difficult to have large enough samples to get down to geographies, especially going beyond the state, going to specific racial and ethnic groups due to smaller sample sizes. There's also the timeliness of the data, which is a concern. So there's a need for more wealth data, certainly. There was, for example, the study that Alicia mentioned, or that stat about the 81 times wealth of white households compared to Black came from a study in a specific survey that was done called Colored Wealth that was done with some colleagues here at Urban as well as colleagues at the New School of Duke. So that's one way of getting at a more disaggregated data, but of course it's time consuming and costly. And I know that Madeline Brown, my colleague, mentioned in the chat that this is something Urban's working on as well, looking at some other ways to get better wealth data disaggregated by race and smaller geographies. So then when it comes to determining who's eligible, that's also an issue in terms of having administrative data on wealth. It's not really something that's available. And as we've seen, jurisdictions have had to use income as a proxy to determine who's eligible. Medicaid being a source that, for example, DC mentioned. I'd love to hear if she has any other comments about that. I'll also mention that Massachusetts has also introduced a proposal to have baby bonds there. I'm on a committee for that, looking at eligibility. So this is brand new, but there will certainly be a lot of lessons learned from this and other efforts.
And do you think from what you're seeing, like in Massachusetts or in other jurisdictions, that there is as much attention to like the data collection piece of this and like being able to sort of track, to what extent funds are being like we are reaching all households who could be eligible, that there is progressivity being built in, that they are able to actually use them for the eligible uses as spelled out? Is that infrastructure being built?
It's pretty early for Massachusetts, but I don't know if for DC, there's something that can be shared about that in terms of data collection.
Well, we certainly have identified things that we want to measure. So as a part of the legislation, we've required the CFO, again, it's the lead agency here that will be implementing this program, to look at, the number of eligible children in this program annually, to report out the race and ethnicity of each eligible child where possible, to again report on the amount of funds in each eligible child's trust fund account, to speak to the amount of money in the fund that's gained by investments or that is decreased by investment loss. Also to look at the amount of funding that may be decreased by administrative costs. So this is an annual report that is required to be submitted to the DC Council, again, every year from the CFO, that we then would be able to measure are the intended, recipients, those that we designed this program to receive the funding, and then later on to speak more about how the funds are used. Again, have almost 2 decades to do that sort of evaluation and what has the needle moved in any way. I would also say, I think it was beneficial for us at program design to have the benefit of a health impact assessment done by Pew Charitable Trust. So generally, most people may not look at this type of program as really impacting health, but it does. I think Grieve also mentioned, a family being able to sleep more comfortably at night, knowing that there is money in the bank or being put aside for their children in the future use of college and the like. So we found that there was a huge mental health and other health impacts that were made available. I will also say, to address maybe a forthcoming question about wraparound support and the like, that is a part of this program or the budget proposal. We also provided an expanded earned income tax credit program. We also provided a guaranteed income, model of support as well, understanding that there were more immediate felt needs that needed to be addressed by persons who happen to be of lower income in the district, such that, we realize that baby bonds and child trust fund is more of a long-term assistance, but then of course wanting to meet, the need to access healthcare or whatever, concerns or emergencies may arise much more immediately. And so those opportunities are made on a monthly basis. So again, it could look more like a universal and or guaranteed income. So those are some other things that the district council did as a form of a package when it came to unveiling and or introducing this program.
That's really helpful to hear how you all were thinking about sort of integrating short-term and long-term and making sure they were speaking to each other. And so Ray, I'm curious, like, to what extent is there evidence on that kind of suite of approaches, or is there an example of, a systems level approach that maybe not directly involving baby bonds or trusts, but that sets a kind of model or an example that we can learn from?
Yeah, thank you. I guess when I think about a systems approach, I would make a kind of a point that Trina, I think, made earlier on the first panel, which is, my preference would not be to put baby bonds, child development accounts, college savings accounts, 401ks, kind of in different buckets, but to see them as all part of a larger movement about endowing, poor families with savings and assets early in life. So, I think that the first point here is a systems approach would say, let's all work together here and see how these systems can work together and learn from one another. And, and then secondly, I would say that we need to connect these systems a little bit better than we have. So for example, Senators Hassan and Collins introduced a bill that not only connected the savers credit to 529 contributions, but also allows rollovers into IRAs. So you're making a connection between disparate saving systems that really should be a little bit more unified. I think that's important. I think the 401 kids example in Wisconsin is promising. It's at birth. There's a bucket for emergency medical, for emergencies related to your health. And then there's allowable uses for buying a home, going to college, and retirement. So, I think there's examples of these around the country. So I think we can connect these. And just on your final point, how do we get the income and the wealth? How do we get these systems to work together? I mean, they both are necessary. Assets was left off the table for too long. I think we're adding that to the equation. That's critical. There's evidence, as I mentioned earlier, that can work. But we have a long way to go to get there too, which includes making sure that assets aren't penalized in the social safety net. That would be a systems approach, but also making sure that wealth building accounts have a complementary or an adjacent emergency savings bucket, because we've learned that locking up the money and telling families you can't use it doesn't address their short-term needs that make wealth building possible. So I'm not saying don't have restrictions, but make sure there's a complementary set of income support policies that help families manage emergencies and volatility. Otherwise, it's going to be hard for them to build the wealth that's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that really, I think, gets to the point of, it's not about one policy in one bucket needing to solve everything, but it's about thinking of, how can these systems plug into each other? And I wonder if that makes me wonder about what is the role of public-private partnership or the opportunities to pull in the private sector here. Are they part of the complementarity?
Well, I can answer that, and just, to answer also a couple of questions that were posed in the chat, how we are looking at it. So folks have asked me, specifically about evaluation. And so I know that there are certain entities and institutions that may be interested, in partnering with us, because I don't think that we as a district government should necessarily be evaluating ourselves. So I see that as an opportunity for, a partnership. Also, someone posed a question about, should we increase the age of maturity from, say, 18 to 21 and or 25? It'd be great if there were potentially a financial or other partner who would say, we love what you're doing. We would love to invest in potentially DC, being it's the first to move toward implementation. And maybe it would be to grow this, to expand the age, if you will. So I think those are just a couple of ways that public-private partnerships could assist with respect to implementation. But then, of course, I spoke a little bit about what it looked like around program design as well.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And so I think that kind of gets us to the point of, like, these are long-term investments that, as we're conceptualizing them, even with the complementarity of, like, short-term, basic income or short-term emergency savings provisions. So given that most of these dollars either haven't been dispersed yet or have not reached this age of maturity, for many of its intended recipients, So we haven't had this opportunity to complete a long-term evaluation yet. So how should policymakers be thinking about evaluating these initiatives, both like in terms of short-term outcomes and medium-term outcomes before we get to the long-term, what's happening to kids when they turn 18 or 21? Afranim, I'll start with you on this one.
Sure. So I would say in the shorter term, of course, looking at whether the number of people who should be enrolled matched what was estimated, looking at whether in the medium term, perhaps, for example, in Massachusetts has been talk about having some opportunities for young people to learn about what the different investment options are once they turn 18. So some understanding of how much they're learning about that, and some pre and post tests for that. Of course, understanding the funds are growing and making money is of course important. Long term, there's a number of questions whether we see differences related to home ownership, retirement savings, enrolling in higher ed, perhaps completing higher ed, since having a lot of debt in college is a primary reason why people end up not being able to complete it. Being able to transfer wealth intergenerationally. I mean, ideally, there would be some way to collect data from the recipients and perhaps a similar group, whether that's in terms of similarity in demographics, geography, maybe people are just beyond that eligibility level, so we can make a good comparison to the effectiveness. And of course, there's a lot of questions around equity that you might get to later. To what extent we're seeing some changes in racial wealth inequities.
And just a quick follow-up on that, from the chat, when you're thinking about measuring that racial wealth gap, are you thinking about it at the median or at the mean? Just to get really technical here for a second.
Yeah, so I know that there's studies, for example, from Columbia that looked at the opportunity to narrow the racial wealth gap from a ratio, for the Black-white racial wealth gap, for example, from like 16 to 1.4 for young people age 18 to 25. So that was at the median. So it's a really good question. I'm not sure what that estimate would be at the mean, but I think the potential is certainly there, and the opportunity for, so for example, at the federal level, the proposal from Booker and others could have young people having as much as $46,000, somewhere around that, by the age of 18, if they're about 100% of the poverty level. That's a significant amount of funds that they would not have otherwise. So that is something to take into account as well, aside from thinking about the racial wealth inequities closing. And for Black households, that would be a significant amount of money, of course.
Right.
I mean, I just think this mean versus median question is an important one. If you look at the racial wealth gap at the median, it's about 160,000. The racial wealth gap at the mean is about 840,000. So much Black wealth, so much of the gap is above the midpoint that, this difference really does matter. And I think if you're thinking about some kind of redress or, reparative solutions, you have to think hard about the mean too.
Mm-hmm. So given that you brought up reparative solutions, curious about the panelists' thoughts about how you would discuss baby bonds as a form of reparations for Black Americans in particular. Though obviously baby bonds are being discussed as a more widely, distributed benefit, is there a reparative aspect to this for Black families? Mm-hmm.
I should have said this earlier, my own views, not the Fed's.
Not the Fed's, yes.
We don't have a position on reparations, but we have looked into the issue of the racial wealth gap. And I think to really close it, you have to look both historically, things like some sort of redress or reparations. You have to look at current policies like student loan policies and home ownership. And you have to look prospectively as well, things like baby bonds. If you don't work in all three of those areas, looking back, what we have now and looking forward, I think it's hard to make a meaningful dent in the gap.
Well, and I think highlighting that the measures that we choose also end up determining what the scale or scope of that policy solution might look like. Also feels like an important takeaway here. Alicia or Ray, this might be a question for either of you. As we're thinking about a systems approach and funding and scaling baby bonds, what are the potential revenue sources for any program? So one of the questions from the chat was that, is there a way to use existing resources, like whether it's the TANF program or other, cash assistance programs, let's say, or are there even other revenue sources, some of which got discussed, I think, in the first panel, but
Sure.
what is the revenue side of putting together this systems approach?
Sure. So I agree with some of the panelists, of course, as well as the questions that were posed by the watchers, if you will. And there needing to be an identified, dedicated revenue source moving forward to support this sort of initiative, being that it is, over decades, right? If we continue to do it beyond the initial 20 years. What we have done in the district, of course, is to initially seed it with our general revenue, right? So we budgeted for it for the current fiscal year, which is for financial plan, which is 4 years, in hopes that we would continue to do it, of course. But we do have our eyes on our lottery and sports wagering program as a potential, dedicated source. While the District of Columbia is not yet a state, we do have medical marijuana, and so we have our eye on recreational marijuana. So hopefully the federal rider could be lifted such that we can identify and use this as a dedicated funding source. But we are looking to do so, within this fiscal year and definitely this financial plan to ensure that we're able to move forward beyond using just our general revenue.
Mm-hmm.
I would just make a very general point. I mean, there's a lot of potential in connecting existing income streams and tax credits to savings and baby bonds opportunities. I certainly agree that we need new and dedicated funding that's not necessarily dependent on appropriations. But there was a new UBI experiment in California where mothers were given some extra funds and they chose on their own to save some of that. And so we're connecting a hopefully expanded child tax credit to some sort of a child development account also is really exciting. More broadly, I think Dorothy Brown's book is really important here. The tax code has been an engine of both wealth inequality and the racial wealth gap. And that's on autopilot. It's not subject to annual appropriation. The non-poor have been building quite a bit of wealth through the tax code, fairly, unfairly, fairly regressively. And so I think we just need to make that system work better for everybody. Sort of just, it's what we do. It's what we offer, Americans who need to save and build wealth and not subject to annual appropriation. So I think we that has to be an important part of the solution, although I hope there are others.
Follow up on the revenue point from a question in the chat. In some states where public funding of any kind may not be an option, are there downsides to starting with private money to seed these accounts?
I would say it could potentially be the same downside as if you were to use government funds, right? In terms of the shifting of political winds, what may still be popular, or the it item, if I could say that, or program to fund. Also, how long was that initial commitment from that private funder? And how, are you able to leverage that to get additional, more sustained funding moving forward? So I would kind of think that the challenges and or cons are the same regardless of the funding source, because you want to make sure that you have a partner that is, committed, and that they're committed for the longer or midterm haul, such that you'll be able to leverage additional funding where necessary.
Would agree. And to add on to that, I'm sure a private funding source, it just wouldn't be a sufficient amount of money to cover what's needed for baby bonds. But if there were perhaps some pilot program that's been done, for example, for basic income, there are lessons learned that could be applied to something broader that's funded by the government.
Yeah, I would just add briefly that the private sector foundations, my foundation Ford, so many made the evidence possible, that have made the policies possible. So that's critical, that catalytic role that I believe they play. But I would say the a critical role for government is setting up the plumbing, the infrastructure, making sure every kid has an account to begin with. That's just so essential. The public was behind the 529 infrastructure, that now there are public contributions, there's private contributions going into those. So, once the infrastructure is in place, I think there's, a primary role for the public sector, but critical roles for nonprofits, foundations, and communities and families to contribute to those accounts. So I think everybody has an important role to play, but the seminal role really is the public creating the infrastructure that makes wealth building possible.
Which gets back to your very first point about having structured savings mechanisms, right? And getting that structure in place is what we have learned from past work makes the difference. And then what the different models and or features are may vary by states and localities. Clearly, there is so much more for us to discuss here on how we understand what's been done so far, how we might think about evaluating and accounting for the evolving nature of these programs going forward. And alas, we are running out of time. So I want to thank the three of you first, Afranima, Ray, and Alicia, for bringing such depth of knowledge and concrete examples and vision for what where we need to be looking. And I want to thank our audience for their incredible engagement and bringing such good considerations and questions to the fore here. I think my urban colleagues have put in the chat a link to a survey. It's really quick. Promise it won't take very long. Would just love to hear your thoughts about what you've learned both from this panel and ideas for the future, and also potential additional speakers and guests. And also want to thank all of my colleagues at the Urban Institute who made and JPMC who made this event happen today, and to our previous panelists as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Take care.